What's the most jaw-dropping reason a bride or groom walked out before saying, I do? Story 1. Everything was perfect. The flowers, the music, the venue. The bride walked down the aisle, glowing. Then, right as they reached the vows, the groom hesitated. He turned to his bride and said, I can't do this. Gasps filled the room. The bride, stunned, whispered, What? Then the groom took a deep breath and confessed, I'm in love with your sister. Dead silence. The bride's sister, her maid of honor, turned pale. The bride, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just calmly removed her veil, handed her bouquet to her mother, and walked straight out of the church. A week later, she posted a photo of herself on a beach with a drink in hand. Caption, Dodged a bullet. Story 2. It was the happiest day of her life until it wasn't. The groom had always been a bit secretive about his past, but she never imagined he had another wife. A random guest, someone from the groom's hometown, recognized him and casually asked the bride, So, how does his first wife feel about this? The bride thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Turns out, he had never officially divorced his ex. He just moved away and pretended that marriage never happened. The bride didn't say a word. She just turned to the officiant and said, Well, I guess he can't say I do, but I sure as hell can say I don't. Then she left, and the wedding turned into the weirdest, most awkward dinner party of all time. Story 3. The moment the groom saw his fiancée walking down the aisle, his face turned ghostly pale. Not out of nerves, but out of shock. The bride's father walked her up, kissed her on the cheek, and then stood beside her. That's when the groom took a step back and mumbled, No way. Everyone was confused until he said it out loud. That's my mom's ex-husband. Turns out, the bride's father was the groom's biological dad, who had left his mother when he was a baby. He had grown up believing his stepfather was his real dad. The bride's father had never mentioned having another child. They stopped the ceremony, had an emergency family meeting, and confirmed with DNA tests a week later. They were half-siblings. Needless to say, the wedding was canceled. Story 4. The groom had always been a little suspicious about his fiancée's relationship with her best friend, but she swore they were just close friends and he had no reason to doubt her. That is, until the officiant asked if anyone objected, and the best friend stood up. She walked right to the bride, grabbed her hands, and said, Don't do this. Marry me instead. The whole room fell silent. The bride froze. Then, to everyone's shock, she whispered, Okay. She turned to the groom, tears in her eyes, and simply said, I'm so sorry. The groom just nodded, completely numb, as his bride-to-be walked out with her best friend, now her future bride. Story 5. The bride's phone buzzed during the reception. She glanced at it, expecting a congratulatory text. Instead, she found a message from an unknown number with a video attached. Curious, she opened it. The video? Her groom, from the night before, in a hotel with her maid of honor. The whole reception hall watched as the bride, stone-faced, calmly stood up and tapped her champagne glass. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, holding up her phone, I just received a wedding gift I'd like to share. She airplayed the video onto the giant screen meant for their wedding slideshow. The groom turned pale. The maid of honor ran for the exit. The guests sat in absolute horror. The bride? She simply set down her bouquet, grabbed a bottle of champagne, and walked out. Cheers and applause following her the whole way. Story 6. The wedding was set in a beautiful outdoor garden, candles flickering, guests eagerly waiting. The bride was breathtaking, the groom visibly nervous. But when the officiant asked if anyone objected, an older man stood up from the back row. Son, he said, his voice shaking, you can't marry her. Confusion spread across the guests. The groom turned pale. Dad, sit down, he hissed. The man didn't. Instead, he turned to the bride. Sweetheart, who's your mother? The bride hesitated before saying her mother's name. The groom's father turned even paler. Oh God, he put his hands over his mouth and whispered, She was my first love. And just like that, the truth came out. The bride's mother had never mentioned a previous relationship, but DNA later confirmed it. She and the groom were half-siblings. The wedding was canceled on the spot. Story 7. The couple had been together for 6 years, and their wedding was supposed to be the fairy tale ending. Until, right before the ceremony, the groom went missing. Panic set in. People searched everywhere. Was he kidnapped? Did he get cold feet? The best man checked the groom's dressing room. Nothing. His phone? Left behind. Then, a bridesmaid screamed. The groom was found in a car behind the venue, passionately making out with his ex-girlfriend, the same ex who had supposedly moved away years ago. The bride, still in her wedding gown, stormed up to them. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just said, Wow, you really made this easy for me. Then she turned around and walked straight back to the venue. Instead of a wedding, they threw the most epic, thank God I found out party. Story 8. Minutes before walking down the aisle, the bride was in her dressing room, checking last-minute details. That's when her soon-to-be mother-in-law walked in, looking smug. "Sweetheart," the woman cooed, "I just wanted you to know, he'll always be mine first." The bride frowned. "What?" The woman smiled. "My son told me he'll never love another woman more than me. And I believe him." The bride, stunned, just stared. Then the mother-in-law casually added, "And between us, I may have told him last night that if he goes through with this wedding, I'll cut him off financially." That was the last straw. The bride marched out, found her groom and asked, "Is it true?" He hesitated. She sighed, lifted her veil and said, "Yeah, I'm out." She didn't even stay for the cake. Story 9. It started like a dream. Everyone gathered, the music playing, the bride and groom standing at the altar. But just as the vows were about to be exchanged, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, ran down the aisle. "Daddy!" she yelled. The bride turned to her fiancé. "What is she talking about?" The groom's face went white. A woman from the crowd stood up. "Oh, did he not tell you?" she said, arms crossed. "That's his daughter. And I'm his wife." Absolute chaos erupted. The groom tried to deny it, but the woman had receipts. Birth certificate, photos, everything. The bride didn't even dignify him with a response. She just took off her ring, handed it to the little girl and said, "You keep this, sweetie. Your daddy clearly has trouble keeping track of important things." And then she walked out. Story 10. 2 days before the wedding, the bride's best friend pulled her aside and hesitated before saying, "I need to show you something." It was an Instagram message request. From a stranger, attached, a picture of the groom in a Vegas wedding chapel with a woman in a white dress beside him. The bride laughed at first. "That's obviously fake." The best friend scrolled. More photos. A marriage certificate. A video of the groom drunkenly saying, "Well, guess I'm a married man now." The worst part? The date. 4 months ago. The groom had secretly married someone during a bachelor trip and never mentioned it. The bride walked straight to their apartment, packed her things, and left without a word. On what should have been her wedding day, she posted a simple caption, "New beginnings." Story 11. The bride was excited. This was the happiest day of her life. Or at least, it should have been. Everything was set. The venue was breathtaking. The guests were seated, and the love of her life was waiting at the altar. Then, right before she walked down the aisle, her soon-to-be sister-in-law pulled her aside. "I think you should see this," she whispered, handing over her phone. It was a series of texts, dozens of them, between the groom and someone named Vanessa. The messages weren't just flirtatious. They were detailed, explicit, recent. Heart-pounding, the bride scrolled through. The most recent message had been sent just that morning. The text? "I can't wait to see you tonight, baby. One last time before I lock myself down." Her breath caught in her throat. The sister-in-law put a hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. The bride didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply took a deep breath, straightened her dress, and walked toward the altar. But instead of standing beside her groom, she took the microphone from the officiant. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, "we're going to have a slight change of plans." She turned to the groom, holding up her phone. "Vanessa says hi." The color drained from his face. The crowd murmured. The bride set her bouquet down, removed her veil, and smiled. "Enjoy the party, everyone. I sure as hell won't be staying." And with that, she walked out, leaving the groom humiliated in front of everyone. Story 12. The groom had always seemed like the perfect guy. Charming, funny, romantic. The bride thought she knew everything about him. Until, minutes before walking down the aisle, his ex-fiancée showed up at the venue. At first, security tried to stop her, but she screamed, "He did the same thing to me." The bride, confused and already feeling uneasy, decided to hear her out. What she learned made her stomach drop. The ex-fiancé told her that 2 years ago, she had been in the exact same position. Dress on, guests waiting, about to walk down the aisle. But the groom had disappeared. He never showed up. No calls, no texts, just gone. She spent months trying to figure out why. Turns out, he had been engaged to multiple women before, always leaving right before saying, "I do." "But he didn't leave you," the ex said bitterly. Which means he either finally found the one, or he just hasn't found his next escape route yet. The bride felt sick. Her hands shook. Could it be true? She took a deep breath and made a decision. She walked out to the altar, looked into the groom's eyes, and asked, "Are you planning to stay?" The room was silent. He hesitated. That was all she needed. She turned to the crowd and said, "I'm not going to be number 4. Then she walked straight out of her own wedding. Story 13. The reception was already set up. Guests were drinking, the DJ was playing soft music, and the bride was in her dressing room going over her vows. She was nervous but excited, until a bridesmaid stormed in, furious. You knew about this, right? She hissed. The bride blinked. Knew about what? The bridesmaid shoved her phone forward. On the screen was a wedding registry, not for this wedding, but for another one, for her fiancé, with a different woman. The date on the registry, 3 months from now. Shaking, the bride clicked on the... It was real. It had his full name, his picture, even an engagement announcement. Her heart pounded. Could this be a mistake? A joke? She left the room and found her fiancé joking with his groomsmen. She held up the phone. Explain this. His face dropped. He stammered. It's not what it looks like. But the evidence was right there. The bride laughed, a cold, disbelieving laugh. Then she turned to the guests, lifted her champagne glass and said, "Change of plans, everyone. Instead of a wedding, we're having a breakup party. Drinks on him." Then she grabbed a bottle, chugged straight from it, and walked out, leaving the groom humiliated. Story 14. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. The bride was glowing, walking down the aisle, heart racing. She looked up at her soon-to-be husband, who was smiling at her. But then, his phone rang. The officiant paused. The groom awkwardly fumbled to silence it. But before he could, the bride saw the name flashing on the screen. Baby. Confused, she turned to look at him. He went pale. She felt her stomach drop. Slowly, she turned to the crowd. "Who is baby?" Silence. Then, from the back, a woman stood up. "A pregnant... I am," she said, "and I was under the impression that I was marrying." The gasps were deafening. The groom stammered, It's not what you think." But the bride? She just nodded. Then, in front of everyone, she slapped the groom so hard his boutonniere fell off. "Congrats," she said to the pregnant woman. "He's all yours." Then she walked out, veil trailing behind her like a queen. Story 15. It was a destination wedding on a gorgeous beach, and everything had gone smoothly, until the night before the wedding. The bride was in her hotel suite when her maid of honor knocked, looking panicked. "You need to see this," she said, shoving a laptop forward. It was a video from a hidden camera in the groom's bachelor suite. The bride pressed play. The video showed the groom, her fiancé, laughing, drinking, and then kissing someone. Then more than kissing. With a bridesmaid. The bride closed the laptop. Her hands shook. She took a deep breath. The next morning, she put on her wedding dress, walked to the altar, and waited until the very last moment before saying her vows. Then she smiled sweetly and said, "I'd like to play a special video for everyone." The screen lit up. The footage played. The groom's face fell apart. The bridesmaid ran. The bride? She turned to the guests, curtsied, and walked straight into the ocean. Because if she was going to make an exit, she was going to make it legendary. Story 16. The wedding had been planned for over a year, and everything was perfect. The venue was breathtaking. The guests were seated, and the groom stood at the altar, nervously adjusting his tie. The bride walked down the aisle, glowing, her heart pounding with excitement. Then, right before the vows, the groom's phone buzzed. At first, he ignored it. But then, it buzzed again. And again. The officiant paused, looking slightly annoyed. The groom, clearly flustered, pulled his phone from his pocket to silence it. But when he glanced at the screen, he froze. The bride saw his expression shift, his face going pale, his mouth slightly open. She frowned. "What's wrong?" she whispered. The groom didn't answer. Instead, the best man, his closest friend, suddenly stood up from his seat, looked at the groom, then turned to the bride and said, "I'm sorry, but I can't let this happen." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bride's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. The best man hesitated, then sighed and turned to the guests. He cheated on her. Last night. With his ex? The silence was deafening. The bride blinked, then turned to the groom, who was now visibly sweating. "Is this true?" she asked. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "And then?" She laughed. Not out of joy, but out of disbelief. Wow, she muttered, shaking her head. She took off her engagement ring, placed it in the groom's palm, and then, in front of everyone, turned to the best man. "Thanks for the heads up," she said. "Want to grab a drink?" And with that, she walked out, leaving the groom standing there like a fool. Story 17. The reception was already in full swing when the bride stepped aside to check her phone. A bridesmaid had whispered to her earlier, "You might want to take a look at something." But she had brushed it off. Now, with her curiosity piqued, she opened her messages. And what she saw nearly made her drop her champagne glass. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line? "Your fiancé isn't who you think he is." With shaking hands, she opened the email. Inside were screenshots, bank statements, wedding deposits, transactions she didn't recognize. Then came the photos. Pictures of her fiancé with another woman, in different countries. There was even a marriage certificate. His name. Her name. Dated 6 months ago. Her world spun. She took a deep breath, then calmly walked back into the reception. Her guests were laughing, clinking glasses, celebrating what they thought was the happiest day of her life. She tapped the microphone. "Excuse me, everyone," she said, her voice steady. "Change of plans." She turned to the groom. "I hope your actual wife doesn't mind me keeping the gifts," she said sweetly, then held up her phone and pressed AirPlay, projecting the proof onto the big screen for everyone to see. The guests gasped. The groom stammered. The bride? She grabbed the biggest bottle of champagne, popped it open, and walked out like a queen. Story 18. The ceremony had barely started when the groom's mother walked up to the altar, interrupting the officiant. "Wait," she said, raising a hand. Everyone stared. She turned to the bride. "Before you marry my son, there's something you need to know." The bride's stomach twisted. The groom groaned. "Mom, sit down," he hissed. She ignored him. "He's already married." Silence. The bride blinked. "Excuse me?" The mother nodded. "Married. Legally. And he never told you." The officiant slowly closed the wedding book. The guests whispered. The bride felt the room start to spin. She turned to her fiancé. "Tell me she's lying," she whispered. The groom sighed and rubbed his temples. "It's complicated." The bride took a step back. "You're married?" "Technically," he mumbled. "But we're separated." The bride held up her hand. "Enough." She turned to the guests, then back to the groom. "You know, I had a gut feeling something was off," she said, shaking her head. "But I ignored it. I won't make that mistake again." Then she turned on her heel and walked straight out, leaving him to deal with his real wife. Story 19. The groom was standing at the altar, smiling as the bride walked toward him. The music swelled. The guests wiped away happy tears. But right before the vows, someone from the crowd yelled, "Stop!" A man rushed forward. The bride froze. It was her ex-boyfriend. "I know this is crazy," he panted, looking directly at her. "But you can't do this. I love you. I always have." The guests gasped. The groom turned red. The bride? She stood there blinking, as a rush of emotions flooded through her. And then, without saying a word, she turned to the groom, took his hands, and said softly, "I'm so sorry." Then she walked away, following her ex, leaving the groom standing there in stunned silence. Story 20. The bride was getting ready in her dressing room when her little cousin ran in, giggling. "I found a secret," the little girl chirped, holding up a tiny notebook. Curious, the bride took it. It was the groom's pocket planner. She flipped through the pages and her stomach dropped. Under today's date, it read, "Wedding." She's actually going through with it. Then, tomorrow's entry. "Talk to lawyer about divorce." Her hands shook. She kept flipping. More notes. "Don't merge bank accounts. Start moving stuff out slowly. Wait 6 months before breaking it off." Her heart pounded. She stood up, calmly walked to the ceremony, and right before the vows, she pulled out the notebook and read every single page aloud. The guests were horrified. The groom tried to grab it. She stepped back, smirked, and said, "I think I'll be skipping the honeymoon." And with that, she tossed the notebook into the crowd, turned on her heel, and left, her veil floating behind her like a cape. Story 21. The day was perfect. The venue was decorated with elegant white roses. The music was soft and romantic, and the guests were eagerly waiting for the moment the couple would say, "I do." The bride was nervous, but not in a cold feet kind of way. She had been feeling off for weeks but had brushed it aside. The love of her life was standing at the altar, waiting. Everything was ready. Then, right before she walked down the aisle, her phone buzzed. It was a blocked number. Curious, she opened the message. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a video, a grainy, late-night recording of her fiancé in a hotel room with someone else. Her heart pounded as she watched him laughing, kissing, and doing things that should only be happening after their wedding night with her cousin. She couldn't breathe. Her bridesmaid, noticing the panic, grabbed the phone. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. The bride clenched her jaw. "He thinks he's going to get away with this." She straightened her dress, took a deep breath, and walked down the aisle. As she reached the altar, the officiant smiled. "We are gathered here today to join these two in holy matrimony." The bride held up a hand. "Actually," she interrupted, turning to the guests, "before we continue, I'd like to share a little wedding surprise." She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and projected the video onto the giant reception screen. Gasps, screams. The cousin, who had been sitting in the front row, went pale and ran out. The groom turned into a stuttering mess. The bride handed the microphone to the officiant. "I think we're done here." Then she turned to the crowd, grinned, and said, "Drinks are still on him, though." The guests cheered as she strutted out, veil trailing behind her like a queen. Story 22. The couple had been together for 9 years. High school sweethearts. Everyone thought they were perfect for each other. But on their wedding day, fate had other plans. It started subtle whispers among the guests. A few exchanged odd glances. The bride didn't notice at first. She was too focused on making this the happiest day of her life. Then, right before the vows, her maid of honor squeezed her hand. "You need to step outside," she whispered. Confused, the bride followed her to the back of the venue, where her father was waiting, his face pale as a sheet. "You're not going to believe this," he said, handing her his phone. On the screen was a live stream of another wedding, and standing at the altar in that wedding, her fiancé. The exact same moment he was supposed to be marrying. He was in a different city, marrying someone else. Her entire body went numb. This has to be a joke. Her father's face was grave. "It's not. He's a con artist, sweetheart. He's done this before. Married multiple women at once for their money." Tears stung her eyes. The guests were waiting. Her entire life was about to change in front of everyone. She took a deep breath, wiped her tears, and walked back inside. When she reached the altar, she smiled at the empty space where the groom should have been. Then she turned to the guests and said, "Change of plans, everyone. Instead of a wedding, we're celebrating my freedom." She grabbed a champagne glass, held it high, and took a sip. The guests, still in shock, slowly started clapping, then cheering. The wedding turned into the best breakup party of all time. And the groom? He was arrested 3 days later. Story 23. The wedding was going smoothly, until the officiant asked if anyone had any objections. That's when the groom raised his hand. The room fell silent. The bride froze. "What?" she whispered. The groom turned to her, his eyes full of regret. "I can't do this," he said softly. Gasps, murmurs. The bride's hands started shaking. "You can't do this?" she repeated. He swallowed hard. "I love someone else." She thought her heart had stopped beating. "Who?" she whispered. Then the best man stood up. "I think he means me," he said. Dead. Silence. The groom turned to the best man, his best friend of 15 years, and nodded. "I love you. I've always loved you." The bride staggered back, feeling like she had been punched in the stomach. The best man swallowed hard. "You were going to marry her anyway? I thought I could go through with it," the groom admitted. "But I can't. I love you." The room erupted. Some people cheered, some gasped, some just stared in absolute shock. The bride took a deep breath, looked between them, then slowly pulled off her engagement ring. "Well," she muttered, dropping it onto the floor, "that's definitely a first." Then she turned to the guests and said, "Someone pour me a drink." She left, but not before stealing the wedding cake. Story 24. The bride had always been close to her fiancé's sister. They were practically best friends, or so she thought. It wasn't until the day of the wedding that she found out the truth. She was getting ready when her soon-to-be sister-in-law walked in, looking nervous. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. The bride laughed. "If you're about to tell me my fiancé is nervous, I already know." The woman took a deep breath. It's about me." The bride frowned. "What about you?" "I'm pregnant," she admitted. The bride blinked. "That's amazing. Congrats." The sister-in-law swallowed hard. "It's his." The world stopped. The bride felt her heart rip in half. She stumbled back, shaking her head. "Tell me you're lying." The sister-in-law's eyes were full of guilt. The bride's chest tightened. "How long?" she whispered. "Over a year," she admitted. The wedding never happened. The bride walked out, threw her engagement ring into the ocean, and left for a month-long vacation. Story 25. Everything was perfect until the bride found a letter on her pillow. It was from the groom. It simply said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." And just like that, he was gone. She never saw him again. But 5 years later, she got a Facebook message. "I made a mistake. Can we talk?" She blocked him and went back to enjoying her honeymoon with her new husband. Story 26. The guests were seated, the music was playing, and the bride was just minutes away from walking down the aisle. She had waited for this moment her whole life. Her dress was perfect, her makeup flawless, and her heart was full of love. Then her phone vibrated. She wasn't supposed to check it. She had made a rule to stay off her phone all morning, but something told her to look. It was a message from an unknown number. "Before you say I do, you should see this." Attached was a photo. Her fiancé, in a dimly lit hotel, lying in bed, with a naked woman beside. She nearly dropped the phone. The timestamp? Last night. Her bridesmaid, sensing something was wrong, grabbed the phone. When she saw the image, her face went white. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The bride took a deep breath. "I'm going to give him what he deserves." She walked down the aisle, her expression unreadable. The groom smiled at, oblivious to what was about to happen. When the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, the bride raised her hand. "I have an objection," she said sweetly, "because my fiancé had a little too much fun last night." She held up the phone, turned the screen toward the guests, and projected the evidence onto the big screen behind them. The gasps, the screams, the groom turned ghost white. The wedding venue fell into absolute chaos. The bride tossed her bouquet at his chest and said, "Good luck explaining this, honey." Then she walked out like an absolute queen, with half the guests following her to the after-party. Story 27. The moment the groom saw the bride walking down the aisle, his expression changed. Not into admiration, not into love, but panic. At first, she thought he was just emotional, overwhelmed by the moment. But then she saw him sweating. His hands were shaking. Then someone from the back of the venue stood up. "I can't let you do this," the man called out. The bride froze. The guests murmured. The man walked forward, his hands balled into fists. "Because she deserves to know the truth before she marries a fraud." The bride turned to her fiancé, heart pound. "What is he talking about?" The groom stammered. I don't know this guy." The man scoffed and pulled out his phone. "Oh, really? Because you sure knew me when you scammed me out of 10 grand last year." The guests gasped. The man continued, "And I'm not the only one. Look him up. He's got 3 fake identities. He moves from town to town, sweet-talks women, marries them, and empties their bank accounts." The bride felt sick. The guests started pulling out their phones. A few seconds later, whispers turned into outraged gasps. Articles, court records. Everything was true. The groom bolted, trying to run, but security tackled him to the ground before he could escape. The bride, standing in shock, looked down at the engagement ring on her finger. Slowly, she took it off and threw it at his face. Then she turned to the guests and said, "Well, I guess I'm single again. Anyone up for drinks?" And the whole crowd cheered. Story 28. The bride and groom had been childhood sweethearts. Everyone thought they were perfect together. The wedding day was meant to be the grand finale of their fairy tale. But just before walking down the aisle, the bride's grandmother grabbed her hand. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "I need to tell you something before it's too late." The bride frowned. "What is it?" Her grandmother hesitated, then said, "Your fiancé's mother. I knew her a long time ago." A long silence. Then the grandmother continued, her voice shaking, "Because she and I were once married to the same man." The bride's stomach dropped. "What?" Her grandmother's eyes filled with horror. "Sweetheart, your fiancé's father is your father too." Everything around the bride went blurry. She stumbled back, shaking her head. No, that's not possible." Her grandmother looked like she wanted to cry. "I wish it wasn't." The bride turned to her mother, who had gone completely pale. "You knew," she whispered. Her mother's lip trembled. The groom, seeing the panic, walked over. "What's going on?" The bride turned to him, her heart shattering. "We can't get married," she whispered. "We're related." The entire venue fell into shocked silence. The wedding was canceled, and their entire lives changed that day. Story 29. The groom had always been a bit of a mama's boy, but the bride never thought it would be a problem. Until the wedding, she was getting ready when his mother walked into the dressing room, smiling sweetly. "You look beautiful, dear," she said. "But before you walk down that aisle, we need to discuss something." The bride smiled, thinking she was about to give her some words of wisdom. Instead, the woman pulled out a contract. It was a prenup, one that basically stated that if the bride ever gained weight, cut her hair short, or disrespected her husband, she would owe his mother $50,000. The bride laughed, thinking it was a joke. The groom's mother smiled. "Oh, it's real. My son has standards, you know." The bride stood up slowly, looking her future monster-in-law dead in the eyes. Then she tore the contract in half, tossed it in the air like confetti, and walked straight out of the venue. The groom ran after her. "Wait! Where are you going?" She didn't even turn around. "To find a man who doesn't need his mommy to handle his relationships." The wedding was canceled. And the groom? He stayed single for a long, long time. Story 30. The couple had planned the wedding for 2 years. Everything was perfect. But then, right before the vows, the best man stood up. "I can't let you do this," he said. The bride turned to him in shock. "What?" The best man took a deep breath. "I need to be honest. I love you." The room went dead silent. The groom laughed nervously. "Dude, what are you—" But the best man cut him off. "I love her. I always have. And I know you don't. You cheated on her multiple times." The bride's heart stopped. The groom turned red. "That's a lie." The best man sighed. "Then let's check your phone." He grabbed the groom's phone off the table, opened his messages, and airplayed the texts onto the big screen. Photos, videos, proof. The bride slapped the groom across the face, handed her bouquet to the best man and said, "You know what? Let's go get a drink." And with that, she left with the best man. Story 31. The bride was minutes away from walking down the aisle, her heart racing with excitement. She had spent the last year meticulously planning every detail, her dress, the flowers, the perfect venue, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. Just as she was about to step into the ceremony, her mother came rushing into the bridal suite, her face pale and her hands trembling. "You need to see this," she whispered, holding out her phone. The bride frowned and took it. It was a live video feed, streaming from her fiancé's bachelor suite. Her stomach twisted. She turned up the volume, and there he was, her soon-to-be husband, shirtless, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed, laughing. A woman in a tight dress, someone the bride didn't recognize, was sitting on his lap, running her fingers through his hair. "I'm getting married in a few hours," he slurred. The woman giggled. "Yeah? So what are we doing right now?" The video cut out. The room spun. The bridesmaid stood in stunned silence. The bride took a deep breath. Slowly, she smoothed her dress, fixed her veil, and picked up her bouquet. Then she walked down the aisle, head held high. The groom grinned as she approached, unaware of what was coming. She reached the altar, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "I know what you did last night." Gasps filled the room. The groom's face went ghost white. The bride turned to the guests, lifted her bouquet, and declared, "This wedding is canceled. But the reception is still on, because I deserve to celebrate. Drinks are on him." The crowd cheered. The groom tried to stammer an excuse, but nobody cared. The bride spent the rest of the night dancing, with his credit card paying for everything. Story 32. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, until it wasn't. The groom stood at the altar, beaming. The guest smiled, waiting for the bride to arrive. Then the church doors swung open, and there she was, walking down the aisle, looking absolutely stunning. But right before she could reach him, the best man stood up. "I'm sorry," he said, voice shaking, "but I can't let this happen." The room went dead silent. The bride froze. The groom's expression shifted from joy to panic. "What the hell are you doing?" the groom hissed. The best man took a deep breath. "I didn't want to say anything, but I can't watch her marry you without knowing the truth." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it around. Text messages, videos, proof. The groom had been cheating, not just with one woman, but multiple. The bride felt her stomach drop. She ripped the phone from the best man's hands and scrolled through the messages. Some were as recent as the night before. She looked at the groom, his face pale, his hands shaking. "You have one chance to tell me the truth," she said, her voice eerily calm. The groom stammered, "It didn't mean anything, babe, I swear." The bride laughed, and then turned to the officiant. "I do not," she said, tossing her bouquet over her shoulder. Then she grabbed the best man's drink, chugged it, and walked out of her own wedding, leaving the groom to deal with the mess he created. Story 33. The bride had always trusted her fiancé, never once questioning his love. But that trust shattered just moments before their wedding ceremony. She was in her dressing room when her maid of honor rushed in, looking panicked. "Something's wrong," she said, thrusting her phone forward. The bride glanced at the screen and her heart stopped. It was a wedding register for her fiancé, with another woman's name next to his. The date on the registry? 2 months from now. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the page. Photos of him with someone else. Matching towels. A honeymoon fund. Her mind spun. Had he been planning to leave her this whole time? A sharp knock on the door made her jump. It was the groom. "Are you ready, babe?" he asked, grinning. The bride took a deep breath, straightened her dress, and walked out to the ceremony. As she reached the altar, she turned to the officiant. "Before we begin," she said sweetly, "I have a little surprise." She pulled out her phone and projected the registry onto the big screen. The guests gasped. The groom's face drained of color. "Congratulations," she said, handing him her bouquet. "You're about to be a groom twice." Then she walked away, leaving him humiliated in front of everyone. Story 34. It was a luxury destination wedding, held at an exclusive beach resort. Everything was perfect until the bride received a mysterious envelope an hour before the ceremony. Inside was a handwritten note. "Before you say I do, check room 237. Her hands trembled as she showed it to her bridesmaids. "It's probably a joke, right?" she asked. Still, something felt off. She went to room 237. Knocked. The door swung open, and there he was, her fiancé, with his ex-girlfriend, wrapped in a towel. The bride stood frozen, staring at the man she was about to marry. He stammered, "This isn't what it looks like." His ex smirked. The bride took off her engagement ring, dropped it in his champagne glass, and walked straight to the reception. She grabbed the mic, smiled, and said, "Change of plans, everyone. The wedding is off, but the party is still on." The guests erupted in cheers. And her ex-fiancé? He was kicked off the resort that. Story 35. The ceremony had already started. The bride and groom stood at the altar, holding hands, gazing into each other's eyes. Then, just as the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, a woman stood up, holding a baby. "Yeah," she said. "I object." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bride whispered to the groom, "Who is that?" The groom went completely pale. The woman smirked. "Oh, you don't recognize me? That's funny. You recognized me just fine 9 months ago." The guests erupted into chaos. The bride snatched her bouquet and hurled it at the groom's head. Then she turned to the woman and said, "You and your baby deserve better. Let's go get a drink." And that's exactly what they did. Story 36. The bride was standing in front of the mirror, minutes away from walking down the aisle. Her bridesmaids were fixing her dress. Her mom was wiping away happy tears and everything was perfect. Then, her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it, but something told her to look. It was a message from an unknown number. "Check your fiancé's Snapchat memories. Now." Her stomach twisted. Her hands trembled as she opened his Snapchat account. She knew his password. She scrolled through the saved memories, and then her blood ran cold. There were videos of him from last night in a hotel room with another woman, half naked. Her fiancé, the man she was about to marry, was laughing into the camera, holding up his wedding ring and joking, "Last night of freedom, boys. Might as well make it count." Her heart stopped. The bridesmaids saw her face and crowded around. "What happened?" She wordlessly showed them the screen. Silence. Then, "Do you still want to get married?" one asked hesitantly. The bride took a deep breath, wiped away her tears and straightened her dress. Then she walked down the aisle. As she reached the altar, she smiled sweetly at her fiancé. The officiant began, "We are gathered here today." She held up a hand. "Actually, before we continue, I'd like to show a little wedding surprise." She turned her phone around and pressed play. The video blared over the speakers. Gasps. Murmurs. The groom's face drained of color. His best man physically stepped away from him. The bride simply took off her ring, threw it at his chest and said, "Hope it was worth it." Then she turned to the guests, held up a champagne glass, and toasted to her freedom. Story 37. The ceremony was about to begin. The groom was standing at the altar, hands clasped, grinning nervously. The guests were waiting, the music was playing, and the bride was about to walk in. Then, the church doors slammed open, and a man, the bride's ex-boyfriend, stormed inside. "I need to speak with you," he said, breathless. Gasps. Whispers. The groom turned red with rage. "Get out." The ex ignored him and looked directly at the bride. "I know this is crazy, but I just found out something. You can't marry him." The bride hesitated. "Why?" The ex swallowed hard. "Because he's engaged to someone else too." Silence. Dead silence. Then, from the back of the room, another woman stood up. "I was wondering when someone would bring that up," she said, crossing her arms. The bride felt her world tilt. "Who are you?" The woman looked at the groom and scoffed. "Apparently I'm his other fiancé." The groom turned pale. "That's not..." The woman pulled out a wedding invitation. For their wedding. Set to happen in 3 weeks. The bride stared at him in horror. Then, slowly, she pulled off her ring and threw it at his feet. "Hope you enjoy the other wedding," she said, and walked out without looking back. Story 38. The bride was waiting in the back of the venue, watching as guests arrived. She felt butterflies. Everything was finally falling into place. Then, her soon-to-be mother-in-law walked in. She was smirking. That was never a good sign. "I just wanted to give you a little gift before you walk down the aisle," she said sweetly, handing her a folder. Curious, the bride opened it. Her heart dropped. Inside was a prenup contract, one that demanded she meet a set of ridiculous conditions. She could never gain more than 10 pounds after marriage. She had to agree to weekly marriage evaluations with his mother. If she ever wanted children, she had to get written approval. If they divorced, she would get nothing, unless his mother approved. The bride's hands shook with rage. She took a deep breath, looked his mother dead in the eyes, and tore the contract in half. Then, she marched up the aisle, not to say "I do," but to look her fiancé in the face and say "I don't." The guests watched in stunned silence as she walked out of the venue, leaving his controlling mother and her spineless fiancé in the dust. Story 39. The reception was in full swing. The bride had changed into her second dress, guests were dancing, and everything was perfect. Then, a little girl, about 5 years old, ran up to the bride and tugged on her dress. "Hi," the little girl said shyly. The bride smiled. "Well, hello there." Then the little girl tilted her head and said, "Are you my new mommy?" The bride's smile froze. "What?" The girl turned and pointed at the groom. "That's my daddy." The bride felt the blood drain from her face. She turned to her husband, her brand new husband. and he looked like he wanted to disappear. Then, a woman walked in, holding the little girl's hand. "Oh, hey," the woman said casually. "So I guess he didn't tell you about us?" The entire room fell silent. The bride took off her wedding ring, set it on the table, and walked out. She didn't even look back. Story 40. The moment the bride walked into the venue, she could feel something was off. People were whispering. Some were giving her nervous glances. Then, her maid of honor pulled her aside, looking panicked. "You need to see this," she whispered. She handed the bride her phone. It was an Instagram post from one of the groom's groomsmen. A video. The groom, at his bachelor party, on his knees, proposing to someone else. Her heart stopped. The caption? Guess he couldn't make up his mind. The bride's entire world crumbled. She took a deep breath, fixed her veil, and walked straight up to the altar. When she reached the groom, she slapped the phone into his hands. "Check your Instagram notifications," she said coldly. He unlocked the phone. His face turned ghost white, and without another word she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in front of everyone. The guests? They cheered. Story 41. The bride stood in her dressing room, hands trembling with excitement. In just minutes, she would walk down the aisle and marry the love of her life. Then, there was a knock at the door. Her maid of honor peeked in, looking pale. "You need to see this," she whispered, shoving a tablet into the bride's hands. Confused, the bride glanced at the screen. It was a live stream, and there, in real time, was her groom, in a hotel with another woman. Her heart stopped. The video showed him laughing, sitting on the edge of the bed, while the woman wrapped her arms around him. She whispered something in his ear, and he kissed her neck. The timestamp? 20 minutes ago. The bride's hands shook with rage. She took a deep breath, lifted the hem of her dress, and stormed into the ceremony hall. As she reached the altar, she smiled at her groom. Then, she threw the tablet at his feet, pressed play, and let the entire venue watch. Gasps, murmurs. The groom's face turned ghost white. "Guess I don't need to say my vows after all," she said, turning to the guests. "But since we already paid for the party, let's celebrate my freedom." The crowd erupted in cheers, and the groom? He wasn't invited to his own wedding reception. Story 42. The ceremony had already started. The bride and groom stood at the altar, hands clasped, ready to say their vows. Then, the doors slammed open. A woman stormed in, dragging a toddler by the hand. "Excuse me," she called out. "Before this guy gets married, maybe he should meet his son." The entire room fell silent. The bride turned to the groom, her face frozen in shock. "Is she serious?" The groom stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. I don't know her." The woman rolled her eyes. "Oh, please." She pulled out her phone and flashed a paternity test. "You ghosted me after our one-night stand, remember? I tracked you down after I saw your wedding announcement in the newspaper." The bride felt sick. She turned to the officiant, took a deep breath, and smiled bitterly. "I think we're done here." She ripped off her veil, handed the toddler a slice of wedding cake, and walked straight out the door. Story 43. The bride had always been close to her fiancé's sister. They were like best friends. At least, that's what she thought. Minutes before the ceremony, the sister-in-law pulled her aside. "I need to tell you something," she said nervously. The bride frowned. "What is it?" The sister-in-law swallowed hard. Then she blurted out the words that shattered everything. "I'm pregnant. And it's his." The bride felt her heart stop beating. "What?" The sister-in-law's eyes filled with guilt. "It started a few months ago. I tried to stop it, but..." The bride staggered back, shaking her head. "Tell me this is a joke," she whispered. The sister-in-law said nothing. The bride's world spun. She turned on her heel, marched down the aisle, and reached her fiancé. Instead of taking his hand, she picked up the microphone. "Before we begin," she said, voice eerily calm, "I'd like everyone to know that the groom is about to be a father. But not with me." The gasps echoed through the church. The groom froze, his face drained of color. The bride pulled off her ring and tossed it straight at his chest. "Good luck with your new family," she spat before walking out. The guests? They booed him out of the church. Story 44. The reception was in full swing, guests were dancing, and the bride had just stepped away to check her phone. That's when she saw it. A notification from an unknown number. A single message. "You should check his private Instagram." Her stomach twisted. Curious, she clicked the link, and her entire world crumbled. It was a second Instagram account, full of photos of her new husband, with another woman. Romantic getaways, candlelit dinners, matching bracelets. The latest post? A picture of him kissing the woman's forehead, caption, "One more night with my true love before I make the biggest mistake of my life." Her breath caught. She stormed into the reception, grabbed the microphone, and cleared her throat. "Hey everyone," she said sweetly. "I just wanted to give a special toast. To my husband. The groom smiled nervously. Then she projected the screenshots onto the big screen. The entire crowd gasped. The groom? He bolted, but not before getting pelted with wedding cake. And the bride? She grabbed a bottle of champagne, popped it open, and danced the night away.